People's Forum and IFCO pastors, thank you so much for whoever started the recording. Appreciate y'all because I forgot. But the Center MLK in Havana, the IFCO Pastors for Peace, and the People's Forum based out of New York are coming together to raise funds to help Cuba recover from Hurricane Melissa. Hurricane Melissa was, of course, yet another rapidly intensifying major hurricane in the Caribbean, direct consequence of catastrophic climate change caused by capitalism. It passed through the eastern part of the island last night and early this morning. There were no deaths of civilians in Cuba, thanks to Cuba's civil defense and the massive mobilization of its state resources and its people to protect each other. Like, it's very different when a hurricane hits Florida. It looks very different in the aftermath. So lives were spared in Cuba because of the Cuban Revolution, because of the organization of Cuban society, but there is still a lot of damage that Cuba will have to recover from, and that will be exacerbated, of course, by the ongoing genocidal U.S. blockade on the island. And so the Cuba Solidarity Forces in the United States are coming together to raise funds for Cuba's relief efforts. And so I'm going to drop the link in the chat. It's also on the slide. If you have spare funds, please consider donating to the People's Forum's Hurricane Relief Campaign. Again, it's multiple US-based Cuba Solidarity formations coming together to combine our resources because the Cubans are calling for us to unify to be more effective. So share the link, donate, and we're also going to put the link up again at the end of the presentation if you don't catch it this time. So, like I said, I want to talk to y'all. I don't want to just talk at y'all. And so I wanted to open up the floor to you. Some of us may be very familiar with Cuba. Some of us may be new to the subject, seeking to learn more. And so a question I have for y'all are, what are your pre-existing perceptions of Cuba, especially when it comes to queer and trans liberation? What things have you heard before? What things have you maybe learned, but you're not sure if it's true? Or maybe you're like very, very familiar with Cuba and you have like some strong opinions. So question for y'all is, what are your pre-existing perceptions of Cuba around queer and trans liberation? And you can feel to drop those thoughts in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you and you come off mute. So what are y'all's thoughts? Is the question clear? Is everybody eating? Okay, there you go, Ermaya, go ahead.
Um, yeah, so I think my perception ever since I found out about queer and trans advancements in Cuba is that Cuba actually has some of the most progressive advancements in the world. And I think it's really inspiring to see. And I think it's motivated so many queer and trans orgs here in the Imperial Court to begin engaging in Cuba solidarity work and begin investigating just how much the US has fallen behind on where we're at with our rights.
Love that answer. 100%. I feel similarly, especially coming from a context where I oftentimes hear attacks on the Cuban Revolution when it comes to queer and trans rights. But the reality of the situation in the US is that queer and trans people are being persecuted to a higher and higher degree every day. Meanwhile, in Cuba, despite being under constant attack, we see so much space in society and so much institutional support of queer and trans people that for those of us trying to change things in the US, there's like a lot of things we can learn from the successes of the Cubans. Other folks have thoughts on this question. What are your pre-existing perceptions of Cuba when it comes to queer and trans liberation? Maybe like two more people. I see something in the chat. I see some book resources in the chat. Thanks, Otis. Tarnell saying recently passed a family code that is very supportive. Yep, that happened in 2022. We will touch on that today. One of the most progressive pieces of legislation in the world when it comes to queer and trans rights, and also recognizing the rights of family structures beyond nuclear families and also children. Okay, so we can keep it moving. I just wanted to check in and see where y'all are at. The next thing that I want us to try to do together is to do some media analysis of imperialist media perspectives on queer liberation in Cuba. Like I mentioned a second ago, there are a lot of narratives about the Cuban Revolution being hostile to queer and trans people, about queer and trans people experiencing oppression specifically in Cuba, and that is oftentimes used as a vector of attack for imperialist organizations, liberal NGOs that are seeking to discredit the Cuban Revolution. It is an extremely mainstream narrative within the Western media. And I wanted us to get into breakout groups and examine an example of this to set us up for the conversation we're going to have in detail about what this actually looks like in Cuba. So I dropped the link in the chat and I can open it up on the screen, I think. Let's see if this will work. Nope, it changed the window. Hold on. Oops, a daisy. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Okay, there we go. This is the correct article, and I will put it up on the screen. Let's see if I can do it. There we go. This is an article published in BBC in 2019 talking about the cancellation of a march against homophobia in Havana. I don't know if folks remember when the story came out, but I certainly do. It was the same year as the first year I went to Cuba, and it caused a lot of controversy within queer liberation organizations here in the United States, caused a lot of criticism for Cuba. And so what I'm asking y'all to do, we set up some breakout groups ahead of time. In retrospect, it's way too many, so I'm going to adjust the size. And what I'm hoping that y'all can do in the breakout groups is read this article together and identify the narratives that you see within the article and where you think they might be coming from. Like, what is the perspective of the author on Cuba? Where do you think that perspective is coming from, and also who benefits from it? And I think that should be, I just put the right article in the chat. Can y'all confirm while I remake the breakout rooms? So do y'all see the article about the cancellation of the Congo against homophobia now in the chat? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so what we're gonna do is I'm gonna randomly assign you to breakout groups, and again, I just want you to read the article together and discuss and break down the narratives that you see within it. And the reason why we're doing this is because we're gonna go deep into what the history of queer liberation actually looks like in Cuba. And so I want you to compare the narratives that you read in this article to what you're actually gonna learn about Cuba's history of queer liberation. So I'm going to open up the breakout groups and we will be randomly assigned. So you just have to accept once you get the invitation to join. It should be open now. You should see a pop-up and all you got to do is hit accept and you'll be in there for 15 minutes. Tranquilo.
Um, so like with the right, because there's that moment where it's like daughter of Raul Castro leads the Cine Sex organization. That doesn't has no relevance to the article pretty much, but it's included because for Westerners, you bring up Castro. Oh God, oh my God, that's like so that's the bad guy. And then it just like, then they can like say claims of like nepotism and uh, monarchy or whatever stupid stuff they're saying. Ironic because, most Western medias wouldn't say the same thing about like Western politicians, right? Like, isn't it weird that like all of Trump's children are in positions of political influence and authority? Um, And then also the some like they say they have that little bullet point, symbolic gay marriages in Cuban March. Why are they symbolic? Why are they not just like regular gay marriages? Aren't all marriages in a way like symbolic? Can't these people just be happy, right? Like it doesn't have to be like some propaganda, like these people are being forced to symbolically wed each other and show their affection. But yeah, that's I'll leave it at that. There were definitely other things we talked about, but I'd love to hear from other people.
Thanks, Leo, for that very thorough summary. The point you made about how there was like it was sort of implied that like the church had something to do with it, and it was like kind of like the implication that the church, the organized religions or organized religious institutions had like outsized influence on the Cuban government's policy towards queer people. But like for example, like the Catholic Church is like an op of the Cuban Revolution. Whenever the U.S. is trying to get in there, the Catholic Church is like, tell us how we can help you. So like the idea that the Cuban government would be listening to the Catholic Church about oppressing queer people actually makes no sense. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I was in a group with Hope, Cesar, and Maddox, and we also touched on the religion as well, but instead of looking at it in the Latin America's religious context, we looked at it in the that was one of the most popular attacks against the Soviet Union during the Cold War was how godless communism was, and so like to then bring the religion aspect against Cuba and this given that history is interesting. And then we noticed that there's no listed author on this article. And a lot of it is just focusing on this one thing. It's not mentioning, like, there's this one throwaway line. However, only the conga itself was canceled with other events going ahead as planned. Maybe they're doing more things that they didn't do before, and they're using that to replace the conga line. Maybe they're doing more meaningful. Maybe I don't, there's no investigation as to what else is going on and how or maybe like somebody mentioned that there was potentially not they didn't because the blockade might have been blocking the resources that they needed for it or whatever. There's all sorts of other reasons that they didn't go into, and yeah, they seems to be thriving on vagueness.
Yeah, I heard a couple of the groups talking about how vague it is. They say the march is canceled, they don't say why. They say there are other events happening, they don't say what the events are. Like they keep it vague and then allow people's preconceived perceptions about Cuba that have been given to them by, capitalist propaganda against Cuba to fill in the blanks. It's definitely a tactic. Just saying you.
It,
All right, Michael, were you done?
Yes, sir.
yeah, sorry, no, just one last point. I think that the Maddox mentioned that they seem to be sourcing a lot on a Facebook post rather than anything real.
Because we all know Facebook posts are very reliable, am I right? Thanks, Michael. Just saying you.
No, yeah, I think that that was a great point that you just brought up, Onye, and Michael, because that was kind of like what my group focused on. And I was in a group with Ermia and Otis. And we basically just said that the article was very misleading and confusing. Like they were trying to construct a narrative against Cuba, but failed to actually like convey any like formal critique against them. Like some points that were already highlighted, like the Conga was canceled, but the rest of like the activities continued onward. And like the first sentence before the article actually begins, basically like says that Cuba has had 11 parades against homophobia before this one was canceled. So it was mentioned that it might have been a logistical issue that led to like the conga not being able to happen, but that wasn't framed in that way. So like what we basically said is to someone who is uninformed about Cuba and like the structure of their society could easily buy the narrative that they are actually homophobic and are very lacking in their progressiveness in their society, but that's not the reality. And Otis actually brought up, I guess, like a critique against Cuba, but that is a bit legitimate. That shows the progression that their society has had, especially like after the revolution and like present day, in which he highlighted that like in 1971 at an education conference, there was like homosexuality was seen as being deviant and that teachers weren't allowed to, teach at these jobs, and they were purged from their positions. But this was later like something that was brought up in the society, and it was like brought up to the government's attention that it was unjust for people to be purged from their positions, especially due to their own personal sexuality. So this is something that was held in conversation, and adjustments were made in order to prevent discrimination from happening within their society, which the article does highlight that discrimination against people based on their gender and their sex is illegal. So I don't think that the government themselves would, like practice like illegal acts against their own citizens, especially since they uphold the revolution very to a high esteem. So it just seems like a really sloppy, lazy narrative that's being constructed, but it's also the BBC, so we weren't really surprised, to be honest.
Absolutely. Thanks, y'all. Excellent points. And thanks for that additional historical context from Otis. I think there's one more group that can share back if y'all have anything to add. Or if it's all been said, that's real too. I just want to give y'all a chance to share if you would like.
I can share for our group. I think we're the last one. Pretty much, we said some of these things, but not all of them. But the idea of the like logistical roadblock maybe being a more realistic reason why it was canceled. We were thinking about in May Day, how May Day was when we were there in 2023 was delayed by 3 days, and there was probably media coverage that the government canceled May Day, the workers' holiday, when really it was because of a tropical storm. So if you weren't suspicious of why, there was no reason stated.
Also, they canceled the conga. Seems like kind of a nothing burger, and they just turned it into this like they didn't cancel Pride, they canceled the conga. Like
Yep, absolutely. So like based on our experience of going to Cuba and seeing how it functions and seeing like the many logistical barriers put in place by the blockade, like we have the context to understand that like what the article is trying to imply is most likely not the case. And so thank you all for participating in this activity, also for like interacting with each other and breaking down the article. I thought I wanted to start off that way because there are so many narratives about Cuba that were like fed constantly within capitalist media, even within sources that we may consider to be progressive. And it's really important for us to like deconstruct the narratives and identify where they're coming from so we can recognize them right away and also actively struggle against them. And I see Brandy's hand. Go ahead, Brandy.
Yes, even though it's been just a few short years, maybe some long years with COVID-19, I wonder now if the propaganda machine would shy away from trying to elicit hate for Cuba through supporters of LGBTQ communities, trying to say, oh, well, they're not gay enough, because the machine has demonized gay so much since then that to throw shade on Cuba now, would this article more be like, look how gay Cuba is? You know what I mean? I just think, I wonder if they've succeeded in being so anti-gay now that this article might not even fly as negative to Cuba. It might be like, oh, well, that's positive, you know?
I feel like I understand what you're saying, and there are like the right wing, for example, is like virulently homophobic, and so articles about Cuba being homophobic might make them be like Cuba's not so bad. But I will say when the news came out that Cuba was going to allow trans folks to change the gender markers on their identification without requiring them to undergo gender confirmation surgery. I remember like the Gusanos and like the folks confused about Cuba in the comments talking about, but Cuba's like still really homophobic. Cuba's like unsafe for queer people. So that narrative like still exists, even despite all the strides that we're about to talk about, that the Cuban Revolution has made around the question of queer and trans liberation, like people still will trot it out. And that's because the propaganda, the media war against Cuba is so pervasive that the narratives persist in the face of all evidence to the contrary, which is why this 101 session and like breaking down these narratives together is so important. So I'm going to go into the talk at you part of the presentation, but I'm going to keep it brief. So the way I want to ground this whole discussion that we're about to have is in the understanding that it is the masses of people in Cuba who are the primary agents of Cuba's revolutionary transformation. It is the Cubans who have transformed and are transforming Cuba. I want to call back for those of you that were on session 3, where Musa and I talked about the African aspects of Cuban national identity. I want y'all to understand that Cuban national identity as a construct was collectively created by Cuban people during the process of liberating themselves. They understood that they were African, they were indigenous, they were Spanish descent, but they were all facing the same conditions, the same enemy, and they needed to come together. And so they built this identity of Cuban, this revolutionary national identity, in order to encompass all the aspects of where they came from, that African, that indigenous, that Spanish, that Caribbean, that relationships to the entire Americans, and bring all together under one umbrella that they could use to become the people they needed to be to build a liberation nation. So deeply rooted in Cuban national identity is this idea of collective revolutionary transformation, of fighting to change and to end colonization and capitalist exploitation and build something better in its place. That's a deep part of what it means to be Cuban, is this understanding that revolution is an ongoing and collective process of transformation. So of course, the military victory of the Cuban Revolution on January 1st, 1959, rightfully gets a lot of shine. It's like very romantic. We talk about the guerrilla warfare carried out from the Sierra Maestra. We talk about Castro and Che and Vilma Espin building bases of support across the island, waging military victories. We talk about Antonio Maceo. We talked about the armed struggles against Spanish colonialism carried out first by African and indigenous people and then carried to completion by the Cubans themselves. But we have to understand that like the pew pew part, like the part where you are and you're picking up your gun and like hiding in the mountains, is really just a small part of the overall process of revolutionary transformation. Revolution is not a one-time event. Revolution is an ongoing collective process that we undertake together as human beings. And this is what Cubans understand intimately. This is what Cuban national identity is about. It's about building a better world together. And so all of the things that we're going to talk about today are rooted in this understanding of the Cuban Revolutionary Project that the Cubans share. So first thing I want to, just to like set up what we're going to talk about today, you cannot understand how far Cuba has come in terms of queer and trans liberation without understanding where it came from. So I want to talk about queer and transphobia in Cuba in historical context, meaning that it didn't just pop into existence out of nowhere. It was intentionally constructed as a tactic of colonization and capitalism. So we're going to talk about that. Then I'm going to talk about one of the most famous missteps in terms of the struggle for the recognition of queer and trans rights in Cuba. That is the UMAPs. I'm going to talk about what they were and what they were not. And I'm also going to talk about how the Cuban Revolution recognized the issues with them and took steps to stop it, and how Fidel Castro responded. I want to talk about CENISEX, the Federation of Cuban Women, and the process of mass political education that they undertook to transform beliefs about queerness and gender identity in Cuban society. And then I wanted to go into a deeper dive of one example of the outcome of that mass political education campaign, that is Cuba's response to the HIV/AIDS crisis. And we're going to contrast it with the US response, which was, as always, terrible. And picture on the side, as always, Carlotta, heroine of Cuba, one of the leaders of an enslaved African uprising in Matanzas, also rumored to have been a queer African woman who led that uprising with her partner, Fermina. We don't have, like, primary sources confirming this from Carlotta. It's just something that's been speculated about throughout history. And so I recognize her as a queer icon, and I just want to uplift her, also because the painting is badass. So next slide. So this is a quote from a book by Leslie Feinberg. Leslie Feinberg is a trans-masked communist comrade, now an ancestor formerly of Workers' World Party, who wrote a book, Rainbow Solidarity in Defense of Cuba, which I highly, highly recommend if you want to learn more deeply about anything we discussed today, or just about the history of queer resistance in Cuba more broadly. I'll put the link to buy the book in the chat. But this is an excerpt, or a quote rather, from the book, where Comrade Feinberg says, "The 1959 Cuban Revolution faced the odious task of cleaning out the Augean stables filled with 450 years of rotting, stinking oppressor culture excreted by Spanish colonialism and US imperialism. And the US tried to take away every shovel that the Cubans needed to do that work." And the picture on the slide is the storming of Teocalli by Cortez and his troops by Emmanuel Gottlieb Lutz. It's like an artist depiction of Spanish invaders colonizing the Americas. And I put it on the slide because it's essentially a graphic depiction of what Feinberg is explaining, that the reason why homophobia, queer antagonism, machismo existed in Cuba is because it had been institutionalized by Spanish colonialism, and then following Spanish colonialism, US imperialism, and also by capitalism. Foreign invaders, foreign occupiers, foreign colonizers went into indigenous societies all over the world, destroyed the social structures and relationships and beliefs that existed in those societies, and replaced them with strict hierarchies around gender, where only man and woman existed. Man was on top. Everybody that did not fit neatly into those categories was erased, was criminalized, was persecuted, and this was an intentional divide and conquer strategy of colonialism and capitalism. They weaponized patriarchy as a tactic to destroy the social structures of colonized peoples. And so that happened to indigenous peoples all across the Americas. It certainly happened to the indigenous peoples of Cuba. And again, it was a tactic that invaders use to destroy the social structures of those populations and replace them with their own social structures centered around extraction and exploitation. And so when you are talking about queer and trans phobia in Cuba, and really in any state fighting for national liberation, fighting against imperialism, you must put it into historical context. You cannot understand the problems of an oppressed people if you leave out their oppressor. And so you cannot understand homophobia or queer antagonism in Cuba today or at any point without understanding who put it there in the first place. And the last thing I'll say on this slide is that I don't want to create the impression that pre-colonial indigenous societies before European contact were like utopias that didn't have that were all universally accepting of gender variance and queer identity. Like some of them absolutely were, but also some of them, depending on how hierarchical they were, depending on how who controlled resources and why, absolutely did have antagonistic beliefs towards queer and trans identity. But what I'm trying to say overall is that the way that it became institutionalized, the way that it became law, the way that it was forcibly spread across the world was through the process of the spreading of colonialism and capitalism and imperialism. So this is the context for understanding where Cuba was starting from at the origin of the victory of the Cuban Revolution. And so one of the first steps that Cuba took upon the military victory of the Cuban Revolution was to undertake the literacy campaign, which began in 1960. It was an eight-month project where hundreds of thousands of volunteers, many of them quite young as 18, many of them young women and Africans, went into the countryside in Cuba and taught rural workers and peasants how to read. And the reason why this was one of the first projects of the Cuban Revolution was because they had won the military part, but they understood that they needed to undertake a massive process of societal transformation, which was going to require the contribution of every single Cuban living on that island. And as Comrade Malcolm X said, you cannot organize a sleeping people, you must wake them up, and that's how you get action. That was the point of the literacy campaign, for everybody in the Cuban society to understand where the revolution was going and why, and to understand the role that they could play to help build it. They want to get everybody to the same baseline level of understanding so that they could all contribute to building this new revolutionary project. And so I'm going to play a video This is another callback to session 3 to queer feminist icon, African lesbian activist, Professor Norma Gilliard, professor at the University of Havana, also one of the founders of one of the first lesbian women's organizations in Cuba, and also a former member of the Literacy Campaign. She became a volunteer in the Literacy Campaign when she was very young. And so this video is her speaking in Spanish. There will be English subtitles talking about her experience during the Literacy Campaign, what she did, and also how it transformed her. So let me see. Let me make sure that I'm sharing my audio before there we go. Stereo, optimize for video. Okay. And then let me know if you have any issues seeing or hearing this.
Otra de las preguntas que con cierta frecuencia suele inquietarse algunas personas que ven el documental, Otra de las preguntas que con cierta frecuencia suele inquietarse algunas personas que ven el documental, que lo han visto, es cómo fue nuestra preparación, ¿no? Porque bueno, ser jóvenes, como ustedes han visto ahí en las imágenes, que éramos estudiantes, convocados desde el nivel secundario y el nivel preuniversitario, pues bueno, ¿qué podíamos conocer como para de momento convertirnos en maestros? Y esto lleva una historia, ¿no? Es decir, ya antes de que nosotros comenzáramos, como era el proyecto, a partir de enero de 1961, comenzar a hacer la movilización de los estudiantes a los espacios donde se conociera la necesidad de alfabetización. Ya anteriormente habíamos tenido en el país preparación por parte de los maestros, por parte de los libros que íbamos a utilizar, los materiales. Habíamos tenido donaciones de los chinos con los faroles, porque sabíamos que si era campo, pues no había luz. Y sabíamos que si tienen situaciones precarias para vivir y en su economía, pues también sabía que era necesario llevar donde dormir, y por eso también teníamos hamacas. Entonces ese movimiento hacia allá llevó una preparación grande a nivel del gobierno del país. Y desde que arrancamos nos daban uniformes, nos daban las botas para tener cuidado, nos daban una mochila, y en esa mochila teníamos la hamaca, teníamos el farol, teníamos los libros y alguna otra serie de aspectos de las necesidades necesarias para hacer ese trabajo educativo. Teníamos unos libros que eran metodológicos, que nos guiaban de cómo teníamos que hacer, pero también teníamos otros que eran para que ellos directamente aprendieran. Esos libros nos los entregaban en Varadero. Varadero es una playa de Cuba hermosa, donde se hacía todo el entrenamiento para aquellas personas que decidiéramos voluntariamente ir a alfabetizar. Y allí pasábamos más o menos una semana o 10 días con profesores que nos daban las instrucciones, y luego de allí, conociendo las necesidades en el país, en los diferentes campos de toda Cuba, nos iban repartiendo. Ya llegando allí, ya se conocía por el apoyo que también había tenido las organizaciones campesinas, qué campesino había necesitado espejuelos o necesitaba apoyo, o qué campesino tenía la disposición de apoyar, de recibirnos y de atendernos, y todo eso fue un trabajo previo. Por eso un poco el libro, ¿no?, que están viendo aquí en las imágenes, que se llama Un año sin domingo, hace ese reflejo demostrativo, más que demostrativo, ¿no?, ilustra toda esa etapa en que nosotros nos pasamos allí sin sábado ni domingo de paseo, No quiere decir, como vieron en las imágenes, que no había un momento en que nos encontrábamos, bailábamos, conversábamos, pero realmente fue un año dedicado exclusivamente a ese aprendizaje. Yo estuve en un periodo con con esa primera familia, pero luego de ahí tuve posibilidades de alfabetizar a otras 5 personas más en otra casa que se presentó la necesidad y allí igualmente se creó esa familia, una familia que no terminó en el momento de la alfabetización. Pues al pasar de los años he podido encontrarme, como me pasó un momento en el aeropuerto, que niños que eran pequeños cuando yo estaba en su casa alfabetizando, luego eran trabajadores del aeropuerto y como yo soy vivo ahora en La Habana, pero soy de Santiago de Cuba, en ese momento de viaje Habana-Santiago, siempre nos encontrábamos comentando y mirando ya su crecimiento y él a veces hasta con un poco de pena porque recordaba que de niño él me escondía las botas o me hacía maldades y fueron cosas así muy lindas que a uno le fueron quedando como recuerdo y que muchos de esos alfabetizadores luego vivieron.
So I think once again, that was Norma Gaillard, a queer African feminist teacher at the University of Havana and former volunteer with Cuba's literacy campaign, talking about she talks about like the training that the volunteers underwent, how they were deployed to Varadero, how they were given extensive information about the communities that they were going to be serving from peasant organizations, were taught how they could carry out this work of teaching folks how to read, and then they were placed with families, and she talks about working with 5 different families, teaching them how to read and the impact on them. And then she talks about seeing them later at the airport, and how like many teachers had that experience of like being able to see the folks that they had taught to read later on engaged in Cuban society. So I just wanted to share that video both to highlight the level of organization that went into the literacy campaign, but also to highlight the impact on the folks that participated. And again, the intent of the literacy campaign, the reason why this was prioritized as a project by the Cuban Revolution was because they understood in order to take on the work of a society-wide transformation, destroy capitalism, and then build socialism, you need all hands on deck. You need everyone working together to build that shared vision. And in order to build it, you got to understand it. Like that is why it's the first step. And it's a sharp contrast. It's a sharp contrast to how education is valued in capitalist societies like the United States. Okay, so moving to the next slide. So now let's talk about one of the primary narratives that you hear when you hear criticisms of the Cuban Revolution approach to queer and trans liberation. That is the UMAPs, also known as the military units to aid production. So some historical context is that after the military victory of the Cuban Revolution, like I said, they defeated capitalism, but it wasn't just enough to defeat capitalism to get Batista and the US out of there. They had to build something in its place. They had to build a socialist project. And in order to do that, the Cuban Revolution needed to mobilize the entire nation, not just to build a productive planned economy and the infrastructure needed for that economy, but also because they were under constant ongoing attack by the United States. Like this is the same context in which the Bay of Pigs is happening, where the US recruits expats, Cuban expats from Miami, gives them military training in Central America, and sends them to Cuba to attempt to overthrow the Cuban government. It's the same context where volunteers with the literacy campaign were undergoing like straight up terrorist attacks, targeting them, trying to like terrorize the countryside to stop the campaign. It's the same context in which the US is arming and backing mercenaries to carry out attacks on civilian targets within Cuba, all in an attempt to destabilize the Cuban Revolution. So they have to construct a socialist project in the infrastructure for that project, and they also at the same time have to defend it. And so the Cuban Revolution sought to mobilize the entire Cuban population. And one of the main ways that the government did this was through a military draft. And again, it was like a defensive purpose because they were under constant attack, but it was also for infrastructure projects, for building projects. However, there was widespread machismo and patriarchy and homophobia in Cuban society, a lot of hostility to the idea, for example, of enlisting gay men in the military. And so in a capitulation to those patriarchal attitudes, to those homophobic attitudes, the Cuban government decided to form these structures, the UMAPs, the military units to aid production, where folks who were not eligible for the military draft, which included gay men, but also included folks that did not meet the qualifications for the military, and also included religious objectors. And so instead of them being drafted and building the infrastructure projects, instead they were conscripted into the UMAPs, and again, were carrying out the same infrastructure work. So they weren't concentration camps, they weren't punishment, they were ways to mobilize people in order to support the defense and the building of the socialist revolutionary project. However, like I said, patriarchy, homophobia, machismo was widespread in Cuban society. And so while those people could fully have been in the military, instead they were put in the UMAPs because they were considered undesirable, counter-revolutionary. And also because of the widespread anti-human beliefs that were in Cuba at the time as a consequence of colonialism and imperialism, it caused abuse of queer people, of gay men in the UMAPs. So Fidel Castro, talking about them, says, they were not internment units, nor were they punishment units. They gave them, meaning gay men, a chance to work and help the country in those difficult circumstances. But also, I can tell you for sure, there was prejudice against homosexuals. So again, to myth bust, they were not concentration camps. They were not punishment camps. They were alternative to the military draft for populations that were deemed unfit for the draft, which included gay men because of homophobia. And so the gay men were put into the UMAPs in order to be put to work to build the Cuban Socialist Project. However, because of homophobic attitudes, they experienced abuse within the UMAPs. So Cuban people are not a people that take any kind of oppression or exploitation laying down. And so as soon as the abuse started within the UMAPs, there were people in Cuban civil society protesting about it, speaking out against it. Rather than repressing the criticisms and the complaints, when word got back to the Cuban government about the allegations of abuse within the UMAPs, Fidel Castro himself decided to try to go undercover at a UMAP and just observe what conditions were like. He was probably the most famous man in Cuba at the time, so that lasted very short time before he was discovered. And so again, they decided to send more folks in, but less like conspicuous folks. And so instead, the Cuban government sent 100 undercover communist youth into the UMAPs to investigate the treatment that folks were getting and to confirm whether or not the allegations of homophobic abuse were true. The youth found that, in fact, there was widespread mistreatment of gay men within the UMAPs. There was widespread abuse of gay men within the UMAPs. They reported back on this to the government, and the response by the government was to officially disband the UMAPs after systematic mistreatment was confirmed. So again, gay men were put into the UMAPs because they were not eligible for the draft because of homophobia. The widespread nature of homophobic attitudes at the time led to abuse of gay men in the UMAPs. The Cuban government got word, sent folks undercover to investigate, confirmed the mistreatment was happening, and they were like, this is not in alignment with the principles of the Cuban Revolution. This is unacceptable. This needs to be shut down. And they were shut down in 1968. And the quote on the slide is from one of the youth that went undercover in the UMAPs. It came from Leslie Feinberg's book. And the youth says, "We won't leave Cuba. We'll stay and make what is bad not bad." And I wanted to pull it out on the slide because this is an example of Cubans who are participants in their revolutionary project identifying an error, a serious shortcoming of that project, and instead of saying, "Well, throw the whole thing out. It sucks now. I can't support this." Instead, they said, "This is not okay. This is not who we are. So we are going to acknowledge it and we are going to fix it. And that is, again, a very, very, very different attitude than we are taught in the context of capitalist societies. Like I know for a lot of forces in the left, for example, in the West, as soon as a nation resisting imperialism or struggling to build an alternative to capitalism does something that we don't agree with, people come out the woodwork to drop the support. It actually just happened to the Confederation of Alliance of Sahel States because of like articles that went around talking about Ibrahim Traore moving to ban homosexuality, which by the way, that bill has not passed the legislature in Burkina Faso. It's like not even law. But as soon as that came out, people were like, well, that's it. I don't support the AES. I don't support Ibrahim Traore, despite the fact that their concrete resistance to imperialism. They're expelling of foreign military forces in Africa. They're building of national development projects. They're nationalizing of resources. All of those things will lead to concrete improvements of the material conditions of queer and trans people in the Alliance of Sahel States. So even if the leadership is incorrect on this question now, the changes that they are making still benefit queer and trans people. So how can you say screw the whole project? The Cuban youth had the correct attitude. We have to understand that revolutions are collective processes of transformation carried out by human beings. All human beings make mistakes, which means revolutions will make mistakes. The important thing is what happens when we make a mistake. Do we attempt to brush it under the rug and pretend like nothing happened? Or do we face it head on, understand why it happened, and make sure it never happens again? So the last thing I'll highlight about the UMAPs is that in 2010, this newspaper, Jornada in Mexico, did an interview with Fidel Castro where he, with his full chest, was like, there was absolutely homophobia widespread in Cuban society. There was absolutely mistreatment of homosexuals in the UMAPs and throughout the structures of the Cuban Revolution. And that was on me. That was my fault. He took complete accountability for this error. He broke down why it happened without excuses. And as we're going to see throughout the rest of the presentation, not just Fidel Castro, but the whole of Cuban society undertook the work they needed to do to make sure that those mistakes would not be repeated. And so again, revolutions do not have to be perfect. They never will be. They are carried out by human beings. The most important thing is that we recognize our errors, we stop them, and we understand why they happen so that we will not commit them again. And that's precisely what Cuba did with the UMAPs. And so I dropped the link to the interview in the chat. It's in Spanish, but obviously easily translatable if you want to check it out. Oh yeah, and then for real, last thing I'll say on this slide is like, can you imagine like a US president apologizing for anything? I feel like they constantly make decisions that drastically and negatively impact the lives of millions of US citizens, and they never even say my bad. Most of the time, they don't even acknowledge it. Or if they do, they're like, actually, that's your fault. So a president saying, this was on me, I really messed this up, this is why, and this is how we fixed it, is like unheard of within the context of the United States. Someone's talking to me, let me look at the chat. Okay, cool. All right. So let's talk about how Cuba undertook the process of transforming attitudes towards queerness and gender variance across Cuban society. Let's talk about CENESEX. CENESEX is the Centro Nacional de Educación Sexual, also known as Cuba's National Sex Education Center. It was founded at the call of the Federation of Cuban Women in 1977. And so the Federation of Cuban Women is a mass organization. The Cuban Women's Federation, the FMC, is a mass organization of Cuban women that the Cuban Revolution really looks to in terms of carrying out the social revolution, in terms of carrying out the struggle against patriarchy and the struggle for queer and trans liberation. And so the Federation of Cuban Women, in one of their party congresses, said that there needed to be a mass political education campaign in order to build a more enlightened outlook on homosexuality across Cuban society and attempt to undermine the reactionary beliefs that have been propagated by capitalism, by colonialism, by imperialism. And so the Center Sex carried out a national sex gender education campaign in schools and workplaces across Cuba. It was essentially mass political education about gender identity and queerness. And the outcome of this campaign was a massive shift in attitudes on queerness and gender identity across Cuban society. They really went to the root and like help people understand that like queerness, transness, all of these are just parts of the human experience that are completely normal, that should be celebrated, that should not in any way, shape, or form be persecuted, that it's just like part of like the fabric of being a human being. They wanted to inculcate these attitudes in Cuban society, and they did so successfully. And again, I want to contrast the US, because in the US, oftentimes we will have progressive legislation or progressive judicial actions that advance in some way the struggle for queer and trans rights. But the issue is that no work is done on a mass basis to transform the attitudes of the US population. And so what happens is that there's like this seesaw where we go up, we're like, okay, like gay marriage is legalized, gender variance is recognized, we got pronouns in our bio, and then someone like Trump gets in, and all of a sudden we snap back, the seesaw goes back down, because the work has not been done to transform the attitudes of the masses of people in the United States. The change tends to come from the top, which means the change is never stable. They always try to claw it back until you have transformed the hearts and minds of the masses of people around these questions. You will never have mass support for these policies, the mass support that's needed to keep them in place. This is the work that Cuba did, and this work carried out by Senesex laid the foundation for a response to the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 80s that was the foremost in the world, one of the best responses on the planet from a very, very poor country under constant attack. It also laid the foundation for the 2022 Family Code, which we mentioned earlier, one of the most progressive pieces of legislation in the world. And it also laid the foundation for today, ongoing radical queer and trans grassroots organizing in Cuba that is aligned with the Cuban Revolution. So let's talk about Cuba's response to HIV and AIDS. So, just off top, Cuba centered life and also science every single step of the way when it came to its response to HIV and AIDS. At a time when the US government was like, let's use this opportunity to put Haitian people fleeing a coup that we started in Guantanamo in concentration camps and call that AIDS prevention. Cuba was refusing to stigmatize or scapegoat queer or African populations. Cuba, years before they ever had their first diagnosed case of HIV/AIDS, implemented a proactive science-led response. They assigned a multidisciplinary team of doctors and scientists to investigate HIV/AIDS, the virus, understand how it's transmitted, understand the impact of it, so they could focus on prevention. Once the team identified that it was being transmitted by blood, the government moved to prioritize blood safety by discarding and blocking imported blood supplies, and also by installing blood testing centers nationwide. They also realized that transmission was happening through sexual contact, and so they implemented widespread proactive testing and screening, particularly of pregnant women. And they also promoted the use of condoms from the very beginning. They did not scapegoat people. They did not demonize people. They focused on how do we stop the spread of this, and then how do we educate people about it. And so the consequence of this focus on prevention was that Cuba was successfully able to limit transmission of HIV/AIDS within its borders. In 1997, Cuba had 0 mother-to-child transmissions. In contrast, in the same year, 1997, the United States had 7,310 mother-to-child transmissions of HIV. In 1999, 1 in 1,500 people have HIV in Cuba. In 1999, in the United States, it's 1 in 500 have HIV. And again, this is coming from a country that was under constant attack by imperialism, that was living under a genocidal economic blockade that had a fraction of the resources of the US and other Western nations, but was still able to successfully transmit or successfully prevent the transmission of HIV/AIDS within its borders simply by prioritizing the health of its population as a whole. They focus again on prevention, on a science-based response. They also focus on broad sexual education in school to help people understand how to prevent sexually transmitted diseases. And they targeted the virus, not the people who had it, because no one was scapegoated. And also because Cuba has free nationalized healthcare, people were not afraid to report infections, and they were also not afraid to seek treatment. In contrast, the United States, under President Ronald Reagan, did not address the US AIDS epidemic publicly until 1985. By that time, thousands of people were dying completely preventable deaths. And instead, when the US government did finally address AIDS, instead of again focusing on a science-based response, a life-centered response, instead the US government chose to scapegoat queer people, to scapegoat Africans, to scapegoat immigrants in general, to say that it was punishment for being gay, to say that it was like punishment for trying to invade the US as an immigrant, to basically blame the people that got sick instead of focusing on the virus itself. And the consequence of this approach by the US government, as well as the ongoing lack of free healthcare in the United States, is that hundreds of thousands of people died that could have been saved. And the US is a much wealthier country. It has much more infrastructure, and it was still not able to prioritize the well-being of its population. That's the difference between a capitalist society and a socialist society. And again, this work, this approach to AIDS was a direct consequence of the work that Senesex and the Federation of Cuban Women did to transform attitudes to queerness and gender variance in Cuban society. That mass political education work, the literacy campaign, the sexual education campaign, that is what laid the foundation for this HIV/AIDS response from Cuba. Some more examples I want to talk about of the transformation undertaken in Cuban society by Cubans, the consequence of this consciousness-raising work, of this political education work. The Red Barrial Afrodescendiente is a grassroots African-led neighborhood organization based in Havana, but with outposts all over the island. It was founded by queer and trans Afro-Cubans who work on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, doing mutual aid work, but also doing work to help raise consciousness around queer and trans liberation in Cuba, and also around African identity in Cuba. And it's very important to understand that the Red Barrial Afrodescendiente, Afro-Diverso, which is like a subgroup of the Red Barrial Afrodescendiente, led by trans African women, and the Central MLK, another grassroots community organization. All of these are neighborhood organizations, and all of them are aligned with the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban government. They're doing grassroots work, but they understand themselves as part of the Cuban Revolutionary Project, and that is in deep contrast to the narratives that we typically hear about queer and trans organizing in Cuba, where people try to hold up the revolution as somehow antagonistic to that kind of work. No, the people on the ground, in the neighborhoods, in the blocks doing this work support the Cuban Revolution. Another example of the consequences or the product of the consciousness raising of the mass political education work around gender identity, around sexuality in Cuba is, of course, the 2022 Family Code, most progressive piece of legislation in the Western Hemisphere. Of course, legalized same-sex marriage in Cuba, but also was very, very wide-reaching with a lot of impacts. It expanded the definition of what a family is, extending legal protections to non-nuclear, non-biological families. It guaranteed rights for elders as well as children, like rights for children about like what kind of parenting they get, about what kind of autonomy they have in their lives. Like that is all in the Family Code. Of course, it expands the definition of marriage and enshrines protections for queer and trans people across the board. And that work would not have been possible, like that family code would not have been possible without, again, that shift in the attitude of the masses of people in Cuban society. Because the 2022 family code, before it became law through a constitutional referendum that Cubans voted in, I think it passed by like 80% or something like that. But before it even got to that vote, the Cuban family code was constructed and shaped by a series of debates that took place in thousands of places across Cuba, where people in their mass organizations, their workers organizations, their student organizations studied and discussed the proposed content of the Family Code and gave their thoughts about how to shape it into the best piece of legislation. So like when legislation is passed in the United States, does your representative be calling you up and asking your thoughts about it? Do you have meetings in your neighborhood talking about amendments to the Constitution? Do you ever remember doing that? I don't ever. But in Cuba, it's like a day-to-day part of how their project works because the consciousness and participation of the Cuban people is the key aspect of the Cuban revolutionary process. It will not happen without them. They are active participants. They are leaders. We cannot save them. They are saving themselves. I see so much happening in the chat about movies, about resources. Appreciate y'all. And then also someone else pointing out that Cuba's HIV/AIDS response is similar to how they responded to COVID, and the U.S. response to HIV/AIDS is similar to how the U.S. responded to COVID. Cuba prioritized science and public health and life, and the U.S. prioritized profit and turning us against each other as much as possible. So that pattern repeats. It really shows like the differences in values in US society versus Cuban society. So I just want to talk a little bit about Afro-Diverso. Like I said, it is a subgroup of the Red Barrial Afrodescendiente, founded by a trans mass comrade, Argelia, living in Cuba. This is them right here. And so the purpose of Afro-Diverso is popular education. They use cultural events like drag shows, like talent shows, like craft making, like spaces for public discussion to educate folks in Cuba about trans and LGBTQ Cubans. Argelia says one of the biggest things for us is that we are doing this work under a government that fully supports us, a government that understands that only the people can change hearts and minds. You in the US are working underneath and against a government that hates you, that oppresses you, and we cannot relate. This is why popular education is such a powerful tool for us. So grassroots neighborhood organizing for queer and trans people and African people exists in Cuba, and it is fully and openly supported by the Cuban government. They understand themselves as part of the Cuban Revolutionary Project. So now we're gonna move into a summary phase, and then we're gonna get into breakout groups again to discuss some questions. But let's talk about how meaningful transformation happened in Cuba using some principles of Cuba's revolutionary transformation that I just want to call out. First and foremost, queer and trans liberation is essential to building a liberated society. So often in like the last couple of years, I've heard people refer to queer and trans struggles as like culture wars. And I'm like, are you good? It's part of the class war. It's part of the anti-colonial struggle. It's part of the anti-imperialist struggle. Everybody has to come. We have to build the broadest, mass-based, militant, and organized movement, which means that we need queer and trans people. We need women. We need children. We need elders. Everybody has to come, which means we need to build a movement that has space for everybody, which means that changing attitudes, homophobic, trans-antagonistic, queer antagonistic attitudes is part of the work of socialist transformation, and Cuba's example really demonstrates that. It's not a side struggle. It's not solely a culture war issue, and we got to focus on class. It's part of the class struggle. It's the ruling class that institutionalized this in the first place when they were trying to steal from us. So queer and trans liberation is essential to building a liberated society. Cuba shows this. Cuba also shows that they, above all else, prioritize the life and dignity of their population. It is always the primary priority. It is the humans living in Cuba are an objective in and of themselves. They are not a resource to be exploited or used. They are an end in and of themselves. They are the architects of the revolution. You can see that belief all throughout the Cuban Revolution. The other thing you can see is an understanding of revolutions as collective mass processes carried out by human beings. This means that there are going to be mistakes. If you are in the world and you make no mistakes, you are not doing anything. I guarantee it. Because if you're a human being and you're just trying to do stuff, and you're just trying to change things, I guarantee you're going to mess some things up. It's just the nature of the beast. And it's not about not making mistakes. It's about learning from them so you don't do it again. Really, that's all that we asked for. And I feel like Cuba exemplifies that. There are mistakes made throughout the Cuban Revolution, as no one is more transparent about those mistakes than Cubans themselves. It's not about perfection, it is about being engaged in a constant collective process of transformation, of building a collective commitment across your society to building a better way, to be an organized and principled collective struggle, and understanding that we are all connected. So some principles of Cuba's revolutionary transformation. And I think that's the last slide where I talk. I hope it is. Okay, so it's 8:30, and I have 3 questions for y'all to discuss in your breakout groups. I'm going to put you back in the same group. And I just want us to do some processing of this presentation together, the things that came up for us, and some connections that I'm hoping we can make. So first question for y'all is, the idea of revolution as a process implies constant self-criticism and growth. How can solidarity movements better embody this principle of learning from mistakes and adapting? Question 1. Question 2, I argue that queer liberation isn't a side issue, but central to building an anti-colonial socialist society in Cuba. Do you agree? It could be that you heard me say that and you were like, nonsense. So why? Why or why not do you agree? And why are these struggles sometimes separated, do you think? And then last question is, how does public health approach that refuses to segmentize specific groups ultimately prove more effective? And can we see parallels or contrasts in recent global health crises? And so you can pick one question or you can discuss all 3 if you're feeling ambitious, but I want y'all to get into your breakout groups again and discuss these questions together, and let's like process what we've learned. And then before we close out for the night, we can come back and share back. So remember to identify someone in your group who can like summarize for the rest of us what y'all talked about. So any questions about that before we get into our breakout groups? I don't see any hands. I don't see any emojis. So I'm going to open the rooms, and I'll also drop the link to the slide deck in the chat so y'all can go to the question slide in case you forgot when you move into your rooms. Alrighty, so breakout rooms are open, and all you got to do is accept when the pop-up comes up. Hello, Tobin. Do you want to be? Oh, there you go. Alrighty.
Is it for it?
My bedtime.
Wow. Oh, okay. Time flies.
All right. Everybody's still in their groups, yapping. It's very nice. Welcome back, everyone. Sorry to pull you out of your groups. I saw the conversation went to like the very last minute for some of y'all. So I apologize, but I do want to get us out of here by 9 p.m. Eastern. It's a weeknight, you know what I'm saying? It's almost time for bed. Okay, so we had 4 groups. Who would like to share back from their group about what y'all discussed? Go ahead, Tobin.
Yeah. Well, I'll raise several points. My co-participants can throw in if I miss something, but one of the points that we hit on is number 3, and I'm paraphrasing. The public health, not stigmatizing. Is it does it make for a more robust public health policy or approach? And our discussion led it's a lot less scientifically regressive if you're not basing your approach or your analysis on some commonly held social prejudices, but that it's also that's also years of work right here too, but it is definitely necessary. Um, collectivity versus individualism, sense of the collective and a sense of helping out the most oppressed or the least of the least of the least of us, also makes for a stronger society. And part of the another part of the socialist that was raised in this presentation that resonated with us was the idea of criticism and self-criticism, not as a routine, but it's often misunderstood. And probably especially here in the United States, geez, so necessary to building any kind of socialist project. That's part of what we hit on right there. Any one of my comrades can chime in if I miss something.
Thanks, Tobin. Excellent summary. Definitely agree about criticism, self-criticism being like a key aspect of a revolutionary project. Like that's like the tool of analysis that you use to identify the mistakes and why they're happening, both for you as a person, so you don't drown in your contradiction, which I have seen, but also for like the project as a whole, to understand like what's holding it back, where it needs to go. And I think that it can become like ritualized, like a automatic thing in a lot of political spaces, but it's something that's really important to carry out scientifically, like to do that like that deep analysis of where we're falling short and why. Otherwise, we can't move forward together. Who is next? Who would like to report back from their group? Go ahead, Ermaya.
Yeah, our group had a really amazing discussion on the first question. I think one of the big points that was brought up was that, sometimes when people attempt to romanticize revolution or not recognize its mistakes, that can actually be a huge disservice to the revolution, right? Because revolutions don't try to paint themselves as utopias. And so it's really important, even as a part of advancing the revolutionary project itself, to kind of recognize that, of course, there were mistakes, but how are we going to move on from them? And I think another part of our discussion was just how incredible it's been to see how Cuba has taken the lessons of its mistakes and moving forward. Because we talked about how in America, America recognizes the mistakes, but hasn't really learned from it, hasn't moved on from it. And so it's been really incredible to see that a revolutionary society's response to those historical failures was to actually grow from it and develop themselves from it. And then another thing that we talked about was we believe it's unequivocal that the queer and trans struggle is a part of the class struggle. And the reason that it's, sometimes assumed to be separate is because liberal co-optation, of course, takes over everything. And so it's done the same for the queer and trans struggle, but we shouldn't recognize it as being a thing that's been more co-opted by liberalism. It's just another aspect of liberalism trying to take on our movements to essentially put a liberal face to our struggles.
That's an excellent point, that it's like a tactic of co-optation. Like that's what pinkwashing is, to try to align queer liberation with imperialism. But we understand that there's nothing more queer antagonistic than sanctions, than drones, than blockades, when they're literally murdering us. So yeah, I've never heard it phrased that way, but I really like that. Would another group like to report back? I can't remember. Go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we're the third group. Yeah, we talked about a few different elements. I think some of us too focused on like the aspect of um, you know, religion and how like, people are able to be gay, trans, religious, and support the revolution. All in peace and harmony, and how that's possible because of like a healthy socialist program that supports the dignity of all people. Brenda brought up like the importance of the literacy campaign as like essentially like a precursor for public health education and different projects for like solidarity projects to bring syringes to Cuba, and how like they've been equally distributed across all the people who need it versus there being, or what the blockade intends to do, which is to kind of segregate how like money reaches people in Cuba. So yeah, so those are some of the things that came up.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks for that report back. And I think we have one more group. Cesar?
That would be me. All three of my comments just left me all by myself. So I was like, okay, cool. I want to try to paraphrase based on everybody's points. Maddox actually brought up a point that, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, his grandma was actually part of the LGBT movement. And, at the time, even now today, many old gay men still think that Cuba is very not, regressive in modern days today. It's still like an ongoing struggle. People have their own way of thinking. I brought up a point personally of myself because I have to be very self-critical and I have to be openly and transparent now. For me, it was very challenging for me about 10, 15 years ago. I always stood with the Cuban people, but we all have, I guess, our own prejudice. I guess we all have our own disagreements. But as time went on, and you start reading more, and you start actually getting involved with the LGBTQ movement, and especially in Cuba, you start understanding more that it's definitely an anti-colonial. It's all part of the revolutionary force. It's just just looking at it from a different perspective. And of course, having a little brother who's openly gay, which I just found out a few years back, that actually kind of like helped me more understand. So again, I have to be self-critical, but as my dear comrade always said, we're all human beings, we all have our flaws, and we just gotta learn from our mistakes and just keep on pushing forward, So that's pretty much it on my part.
Thank you, Cesar. In the Benson Amos Brigade, we do community agreements, and one of the community agreements we always have is push beyond your growing edge. Push beyond your growing edge. And essentially what that means is that we are not immune from the call to transform, to like unlearn the reactionary and anti-human and anti-life beliefs that we've been indoctrinated into by this society, to become more and more progressive, more and more militant, more and more conscientious people. Like none of us is immune to that process, and we all have work to do. And so push beyond your going edge is just like a way of reminding ourselves that we're in it together and that we all have a responsibility to transform ourselves. But I appreciate y'all. I appreciate the discussions you had. I appreciate your participation tonight. We're gonna move to the closing. And so, like I said, this is the last session of the Cuba 101 series, session 7 of 7. Thank you all so much for coming on tonight, and for all the folks that have participated in these, either by facilitating them or attending or helping with the technical aspects of it. It was truly a collective effort across the network, across organizations. And so just want to share a deep appreciation for y'all. And of course, our deep appreciation for the Cuban Revolution, for providing this like living revolutionary project, this model that we can look to, that we can learn from, and that we should be in unwavering solidarity with. Which takes me to another call for folks that if you have those extra funds, or even if you can just post it on social media, the People's Forum, IFCO Pastors for Peace, and Central MLK are trying to raise funds for Cuba's relief efforts from Hurricane Melissa. And so please, please, please make a donation if you have the resources, or just share the link on social media if you don't, just help get the word out. They are trying to raise $50,000. The link is in the chat. And that is my last announcement for y'all. So again, just want to appreciate you for calling in today. I hope that you have a great rest of your night. Ready for
Thanks.
revolution, y'all. See you later.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you so much, Anye.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
You.